Many years ago, back when I was an undergrad, I did a short video where I talked sort of about estimating the size of armies in the Dark Ages, sort of in early medieval Britain and Ireland specifically. And when I sort of got further along into my master's degree, I went through and removed a lot of my old YouTube videos that I felt just sort of weren't up to that sort of academic standard that I'd sort of now reached. And unfortunately, that was one of the casualties. I just didn't think it was good enough. But recently, I've received a couple requests asking to talk about that very topic. So now, with sort of the benefit of hindsight and a couple extra years research in the field, I've decided I'll try to tackle this topic again. So the Orthodox view is that in the early Middle Ages, we're dealing with smaller scale armies and smaller scale military confrontations than we are in the preceding centuries, sort of in the late Roman period, as well as the following centuries in sort of the later stages of the Middle Ages. And this is largely thought to have come from sort of a political fragmentation. While in sort of late antiquity, you might have sort of all of Roman Britain fielding an army to fight off invasions. And then in the later Middle Ages, you have all of the Kingdom of England fielding armies to fight sort of on the continent. Whereas in this sort of middle period, in the early Middle Ages, you have a bunch of small individual kingdoms that are sort of dividing the manpower that would have fielded those larger armies. And while it's not untrue, I do think it gets a little bit more complicated when we actually start looking at the sources. So let's start by going through some of the legal sources, because I think that's an interesting place to start, as well as just it's something that gets brought up a lot. So the most sort of extreme example of this evidence for smaller armies in the early Middle Ages is the Code of King Ine, which is a series of laws, some of which relating to sort of military matters, but not all of them, which seem to be sort of promulgated around AD 700 in Wessex. And according to these laws of King Ine, an army is defined as being a troop above 35 men. And then it sort of goes down and defines smaller groups under that. So, for instance, less than 35 down to 7 men is considered a band, and then groups of under 7 are considered thieves. So based off of this law code of King Ine, some scholars have suggested that armies could be quite small. Again, 36 or more men make an army. The problem is this text comes from a very specific sort of political and legal context. So we don't want to just sort of accept it wholesale as armies being around 36 men, and instead understand this as a law that's being used in order to be able to more severely punish these groups of 36 or more men. If a lord has a following of just 35 men, have a group above 36 men, and if they do something that breaks the peace, they can be punished more severely. And that does roughly seem to be what's happening. So for instance, if we look at Irish sources that are roughly contemporary, around 30 men seems to be sort of the manpower of an individual lord to be able to sort of have the retinue around them and engage in some small-scale military conflict. So for instance, a group of cattle raiders around a single lord seems to be around 30 men. And then, of course, sometimes on much larger scale raids, you have different lords teaming up, each with their own band of, again, around 30 men. So that roughly similar figure of 36 men being to make an army seems to represent actually a single lord's retinue, a single lord's accompaniment, possibly to do hostile military actions, more so than it is like the actual representation of an army as we would really conceptualize it today. And that by sort of having this loose sort of low threshold on what's considered an army legally means that, if a lord, one of your own lords breaks the peace, you can punish him very severely. Or if there's even like, again, a relatively minor raid from an enemy kingdom, it allows you to sort of claim it's an invasion and sort of project your power and respond much more militaristically than you would if we did define armies as being necessarily larger. And really, I think this is a really good comparison to some modern law practices. Noticeably, I think sort of criminal street gang legislation in the modern United States, which defines, a criminal street gang as being three or more people. Again, an incredibly low threshold if we compare to sort of any actual major gang activity. Really what seems to be going on is it's providing a way for the government to sort of more strictly punish even small scale, what would probably be incredibly minor groups of criminals working together is now considered a gang, and that brings a lot of legal repercussions with it. And that's really what seems to be happening, again, with the Law Code of King Ine. It's not that armies are necessarily actually only fielding a couple dozen men, but it's being written in such a way that those relatively small groups involving only a couple dozen men can now be punished more harshly because of the way that these laws are being written. However, I also think we have a problem sort of moving in the opposite direction, where some law codes can create a situation where armies appear overly large. So we can switch over to talk about a sort of historical text about early Dalriadic Scotland called Senecas Fer na Alaban, or the history of the men of Scotland, which talks about sort of at one point the obligations of military service for the different sort of sub-kingdoms within Dalriada. And based off of this, scholars estimate usually between 1,000 and 2,000 men could be called up for military service, divided between those sort of three large sub-kingdoms of Scotic Dalriada, which, again, seems like a relatively large military force, particularly compared to sort of some of those earlier figures from things like those small cattle raiding bands or the Law Code of King Ine. And however, I also think we sort of have to two large problems we need to account for with this. First, again, being sort of Dalriada, which would sort of merge eventually to create the Kingdom of Scotland, and sort of comes from this sort of Gaelic wider society. There's a bit of a question over how often sort of military service would actually be used. So, for instance, slightly before the creation of the history of the men of Scotland and the fragmentary annals for AD 910, there's a quote that an army of peasants had never been seen. This is in reference to the king of Breffni going off to fight an army of peasants that was raiding around his territory. And based off of this quote, as well as some of the descriptions of sort of more heroic poetry going on at this time, people have suggested that it would actually be quite unusual for the common folk to actually be called upon for military service. One of the scholars actually refers to it as a legal fiction, that fighting was really reserved for the elite upper classes, and only in like incredibly dire circumstances would the common folk actually be called upon to go and fight. And there's a couple different reasons why we might expect this to be the case. One of them is, of course, if your men are out in the army, they're not doing the sort of things they would usually be doing, planting the crops, harvesting the crops, caring for the crops in general, as well as just all that other economic activity. You don't want to be calling up your peasants out of the fields all that often because of how disruptive it would be to their daily life. You might win the battle and then starve to death because nobody was there to call in your harvest. So you want to use it quite sparingly, your ability to call up your men for military service for that purpose. Also, a lot of these law codes that we have and a lot of the other sort of sources of obligation, such as clientship in Ireland particularly, really specify that there's only a certain limited amount of time for which people owed military service. This is usually estimated to be about a month. So, for instance, in the Fjord, which is sort of the Anglo-Saxon equivalent, this obligation that free common folk had to fight, it's usually estimated to be around 40 days worth of military service a year, which isn't actually a lot. So you could also imagine that, if you call up your peasantry to go and fight for you, you only get 40 days out of them, and after that they have no obligation to fight for you the rest of the year. So if you call up all of your peasantry at once, then you're really leaving yourself quite vulnerable the rest of the year, where you don't have anyone obligated to answer your summons for an army. So you want to only have a portion of them actually sort of called up when you need them, so you can call up the next portion, if another crisis arrives. And that's actually something we see in sort of the end of the early medieval period with Alfred the Great of Wessex, who uses the Fyrd extensively, but only a part of them is actually on call at any one time. We're told in the historical sources, that part of the army would be sort of on call, out doing campaign. Another part of the army was left sort of guarding the burhs, these sort of fortified towns that Alfred really promotes the construction of as part of defense. So we might consider them, again, sort of guard duty and probably some policing duty included in that. And then, of course, you have a portion of the men that are not actively being called and instead working the fields, performing their crafts at home and sort of doing the normal things that a peasant would do, because they're not professional soldiers on call all the time. So again, while he does sort of have this obligation of all free men sort of have an obligation to answer the summons of King Alfred and to be used in the military, only a portion of them are actually being used for military activity at any one time, because he also has to space out times when he needs that manpower at home doing the normal economic productivity, as well as those doing guard duty at the burhs. So even though, again, theoretically you have this large pool of manpower to draw from to create your army, it's very unlikely that, a large percentage of them are actually being used. So when we have figures like the history of the men of Scotland, which suggest, again, 1,000 to 2,000 people owing service, probably only a couple hundred of them are actually going to be performing that service at any given time. And we can take this with any of the historical sources. So, elsewhere in Irish sources, we're told that these local kingdoms, of which we have plenty of, up to like 100, 200 small local kingdoms within Ireland, that each of those would owe, again, hundreds of men would owe service in those kingdoms. But again, it's much more likely that only a small percentage of them are actually answering that summons at any point in time. Just because you have the manpower in theory to create armies thousands of men strong, that probably isn't actually going to be reflected on the ground due to all of these other concerns. So it would seem really that our best understanding of the amount of manpower that a kingdom could put forward to sort of fight in the army and engage in military actions is probably into the hundreds. The figure 300 is mentioned quite a lot in these particularly heroic sources, but we do sort of have to take that with a slight tinge of salt, because obviously the number 3 in this sort of early medieval Christian context is a very important number, and particularly having a nice round number, it's always nice to, say you have 300 of something than, 297. So while 300 is this sort of common number put forward for an army, we do have to take that a bit with a grain of salt, just because 300 would have been such a sort of powerful idea of a number. But again, sort of that low hundreds range, depending on, obviously, a smaller kingdom might have 100 or 200, a larger kingdom 500 or 600, we might say, does seem to be relatively accurate. So for instance, I'm going to take a civil war in Wessex between Cyneherd and Cynewulf in the 8th century, sort of the mid to late 8th century. And in it, it's estimated that Cyneherd, one of the sort of claimants to the kingship at this time, had 84 men sort of in his civil war. And of course, being a civil war, this has to only represent, a fraction of the military manpower of this kingdom. So if we would say, half of the kingdom, one side of the Civil War has 84 men, the other one, again, probably also about 100, a little less. We would say overall they might have, 200 men that would actively be fighting in this campaign at any one time. So again, taking some of those references from the heroic poetry that I tend to reference 300 quite a lot, as well as some of these references to sort of less legendary military actions, we might get an estimate that the normal kingdom would fight with a manpower of around hundreds of men, which is quite smaller than the thousands of men we actually see on either side. In sort of the late Roman period or the later Middle Ages, where we do have armies of thousands of men. These armies seem to be hundreds of men. But this is where I think the image really gets a lot more complicated with how we understand how battles are fought. Because a lot of battles and a lot of military actions during the early Middle Ages aren't actually a kingdom fighting a kingdom, but a series of kingdoms fighting another series of kingdoms. It's, a lot of warfare is being fought on these higher levels above the actual kingdom. And we can actually see this quite a lot in the way that sort of battles are being sort of recorded in historical sources, where it's quite frequently mentioned multiple kings, multiple kingdoms fighting battles. So, for instance, the Battle of Durham, which is part of the Anglo-Saxon expansion in the 6th century. So this is fought AD 577. It's recorded that 3 British kings died, and this led to the Anglo-Saxons controlling these 3 local kingdoms. The Battle of Moira, which is fought in Ireland in AD 637, is sort of a fantastic example of this. What seems to have sort of be really a conflict between these 2 rival kingdoms in the north of Ireland. But each of them bring their client kingdoms and their allies to come fight with them. So not only do we have, these different kings within Ireland fighting, but we're also told that, Picts are in this battle, Britons are in this battle, Anglo-Saxons are in this battle, possibly including some exiled lords from Northumbria and their rivals still within Northumbria. But there's even reference to at least a Frankish nobleman bringing a contingent of men from the continent to fight in this battle in Northern Ireland. And again, this is sort of atypical that we're having such far reach as, the Franks arriving to sort of take a side in this war in Northern Ireland. But again, I think it does really illustrate this point well, that we're not dealing with a king fighting a king, but a series of kings fighting a series of kings. And this continues, well into the sort of end period of the early Middle Ages. So, for instance, again in Ireland, at the Battle of Island Bridge in AD 919, we're told that 6 Irish kings died in the fighting. So again, a series of different kingdoms, each with their own armies of hundreds of men, taking place in this battle. The Battle of Brunanburh in AD 937, which is fought in England. We're told that 4 kings were present. The King of Dublin, again, large control over the Scandinavians and the Irish Sea region. The King of Alba, the Kingdom of Scotland, which again is now sort of a unified kingdom, but earlier in the period would have been represented by these different smaller Pictish and Dalratic sub-kingdoms. The King of Outclut on one side, and then the King of England on the other side, who again is now sort of a newly unified King of England, and really represents what in earlier periods would have been, the Kingdom of Wessex, the Kingdom of Mercia, and all of these other smaller English kings. So he's in effect sort of controlling multiple kingdom armies that we might expect with those hundreds of figures, hundreds of men that we mentioned earlier. And then sort of the last example I'll bring up is the Battle of Clontarf, fought in Ireland AD 1014, which again, we have a series of multiple kings on each side, one side being represented by Brian Boru, who is sort of an over-king of Munster, who again has a bunch of client kingdoms in the south of Ireland, fighting his main rival, the King of Leinster, with his client kingdoms plus his outside allies, again with sort of Scandinavians through places like the Kingdom of Dublin or sort of the Kingdom of the Northern Isles. So when we say, an army has hundreds of men, we're really basing it off of the figure that a single kingdom would have hundreds of men as part of their military power. But when we actually look at the sources, it actually seems pretty common sort of across the early medieval period not to see battles and warfare and other military actions being fought on the scale of a kingdom fighting a kingdom, but a large coalition of a king, his allies, and his client kings fighting another such coalition. And each of those kings that are making up those armies control hundreds of men. So in practice, we're still finding battles being fought with thousands of men. It's just sort of that we're defining the army as a much smaller scale than we would sort of in the earlier or later periods of sort of late antiquity and the later Middle Ages. And one of the best ways I think we can understand this is by stepping away a bit from sort of our military focus and just sort of look at that sort of fragmented political hierarchy that I mentioned earlier at the start. That this sort of political fragmentation is really what's causing these smaller scale armies to develop in the early Middle Ages. So, for instance, in the sort of early Middle Ages, we might have a stereotypical situation like this, where we have sort of a single large, relatively temporary sort of over-kingdom by somebody with imperium, is sort of the word that's used a lot in early medieval sources. And under this, he has, again, sort of these large over-kingdoms under them, who each control their own sort of sub-kingdoms under him, under which, of course, you then get sort of your more petty lords. Whereas in contrast, sort of your stereotypical development in the late Middle Ages, you might have a single large king under whom has dukes, under whom has barons, under whom has these petty lords. So to sort of move away from the sort of abstract, we might take, England at the time sort of King Offa, who's described as sort of the Brattenwalde, the sort of ruler of all Britain, somebody who has imperium and is controlling a lot of other large independent kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons, as well as possibly some of the sort of native Britons, the Welsh. And then under this Brattenwalde, you have his direct control, which is a large over-kingdom like Mercia, which is, again, controlling a lot of small sort of regional, tribal, if you like, although that word is a bit sort of problematic, kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Wicca. And then under the Kingdom of Wicca, you have all of these sort of lesser lords, people who aren't kings. And we might compare this to a social structure like we get sort of in the late Middle Ages, where, the Brettonwalde, this sort of king with imperium, we might say is roughly comparable to how we would define the King of England. Therefore, something like the Kingdom of Mercia doesn't actually have a great one-to-one parallel, because Mercia is such a large region. It's roughly comparable to all of the Midlands in sort of modern England. So it's sort of divided between all of these small dukedoms. So, for instance, that small sub-kingdom, the Kingdom of Wicca, we might compare to sort of the Duke of Gloucester. And then under the King of Wicca has all of these lesser lords who might have sort of shire reeves under them. The Duke of Gloucester has all of these sort of lesser lords and knights under them who just have these sort of officials running against small sort of manorial estates. So we can actually see that there is power structures that are sort of mirroring things. It's not uncommon to see sort of England as an entity acting together under sort of figures with imperium, figures called Brettonwaldes. It's just that sort of where we apply that label of king, and therefore where we're defining what makes a kingdom and what makes a kingdom's army, is much lower on that social scale than we do in the later Middle Ages, where you might say, the King of England is forming the army, and, the disputes between sort of two barons, we aren't considering armies going to war. Whereas in the early Middle Ages, you're still getting, the Brettonwalde performing large military actions against, enemies in Wales or in Scotland. But it's just when the King of Wicca goes and fights another small local king, we are considering that two kingdoms going to war and therefore two armies doing war in a way that we don't in sort of the later Middle Ages. And this is something we can actually see quite illustrated particularly well in Ireland, because Ireland has just a large series of small kingdoms. Again, it's estimated maybe around 180 different local kingdoms within Ireland. So really you have a situation where you have, again, these sort of large alliances, which are made up of individual overkings, which are made up of individual local kings, which are made up of individual petty kings, which then are divided into lords, in a way that's actually quite similar to the way that we might have sort of large lordship alliances with kings, with baronies, with sort of lords in the early medieval period. So again, to take a particular kingdom rather than talking about it in the abstract, sort of at the start of the early medieval kingdom, we might have sort of a large collective of kingdoms, something that we might call sort of like the Munster Confederacy, which contains a bunch of local king or a bunch of other over kingdoms, such as the Kingdom of Cashel, the Kingdom of the Daeshimauen, or the Kingdom of Osriga, which we'll be focusing on. And then the Kingdom of Osriga would then, under him, have a bunch of sort of powerful kings that are sort of dividing the territory between them, including the Lord of Uveric, who controls the allegiances of these other smaller, even more local kingdoms. And that's where that 108 local king, or 180 rather, local kingdoms come from. And you might have something like the Uberchan as, again, representing that smallest scale of kingship. And we can see, sort of as we move from the early Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages, the way that kingship becomes more focused on the upper echelons of this hierarchy of power, where we might see, at the start of the early Middle Ages, Ivercon is considered its own kingdom, but once we reach the later Middle Ages, the lords of Ivercon are referred to as that, as lords and as chieftains, and not as kings, and it's only once we get a step higher at the Iveric that we actually get the title of kingship. And then as we move sort of further into the later Middle Ages, even the Iveric aren't kings, only Osriga, gets the kings of Austria as their own title. And then once we really hit sort of the early modern period by around like the 1600s, even Osriga is not really being considered kings, and instead we have what we described as, sort of the Gaelic lordships, and, titles that used to be kings are now earls. And we can sort of see the way that it's not necessarily that sort of this political hierarchy is ever changing. You still have Ibercon owing allegiance to Iveric, owing allegiance to Osriga, owing allegiance to these sort of larger powers, whether that's the Gaelic lordships or the Munster Confederacy. That power structure is exactly the same. It's just that, where do we define what is considered a kingdom in that power structure that changes? And again, if we want to use sort of late antiquity, we can get a similar, although admittedly at this point you really do just have on a larger scale sort of divisions of power, where you might have, the Roman Empire at top, which is divided between the two emperators, one in the east, one in the west, which then is further divided between the dukes, such as, the Dux Britannica, who then has all the governors of the actual local provinces, and then again, all of these small-scale officials under them. And there is conflict happening at all times, whether that's, in late antiquity, in the early Middle Ages, or in the later Middle Ages. There's always different scales of warfare happening, all along this this sort of chain of command. And it's just that battles and warfare appear smaller scale, I would argue, because where we're defining battles and armies and kingdoms is just a smaller scale. So, for instance, if the, local petty king goes and, raids another local petty king in the early Middle Ages, that's probably being written as a battle and possibly as a war between these two kingdoms. Whereas in the late Middle Ages, if, one landed knight goes and harasses the territory of another landed knight, that probably isn't being called a battle, and it probably isn't being called a war. And instead, it's just sort of this small-scale endemic violence that just sort of isn't being talked about in the same way. But it's actually probably involving, similar scales of conflict between, the petty kings and these lesser lords. And you can see that same thing again as you move up the chain. These more local kings might fit again some of the smaller civil wars between dukes asserting their power, and then the large over kings does roughly fit when two kings go to war in the late Middle Ages. It's just that in the Middle Ages, again, we're not considering those smaller scales to really be battles. Or again, if we do something like in Northern Britain to make this conflict sort of a little bit less abstract, we have constant warfare between sort of Pictland and what would sort of become Scotland, and the Kingdom of Northumbria and what would become the Kingdom of England. It's just that in the sort of early Middle Ages, when a local king of the Picts goes and attacks into Northumbria, steals some cattle, and then returns back, we're considering that a sort of war between those two kingdoms. But in the late Middle Ages, if a band of cattle reavers crosses down into England, takes some cattle, and goes back, we're not considering that in itself to be a war between England and Scotland. And that's really where the difference is, and why armies appear to be so much smaller in the early Middle Ages. It's not because large-scale conflict, on the scale of things happening in the late Middle Ages, aren't happening in the early Middle Ages, or that, smaller-scale conflicts that we see in the early Middle Ages aren't happening in the late Middle Ages. Rather, instead, it's just sort of where we're making that cutoff of what's considered an army and what's considered a kingdom is lower, and therefore those smaller, frequent, low-level, small-scale military conflicts are being considered battles and armies and wars in the early Middle Ages, whereas they aren't necessarily being thought of in the same way in the later Middle Ages or in late antiquity. And that's really where I think this is coming from. So I guess to sort of stop myself from rambling too long and get to the actual point, the army of a kingdom might be a few hundreds of men in the early Middle Ages, but we're still seeing this large-scale conflict on the scale of thousands of men being fought in the early Middle Ages. It's just that those conflicts aren't a kingdom fighting another kingdom, but a series of kingdoms held together by alliances and vassalships fighting another series of kingdoms held together in the same way. And it's just that in the sort of other periods, it would be considered, a single king fighting another single king to create that same scale of conflict. But all of those conflicts are occurring both in the larger and smaller scales in all of these different periods of history. So I realize that's not exactly sort of a perfect answer in terms of just, being able to rattle off some numbers or anything. But I think it is sort of important to understand, the way that this is working and the way that these sort of different kingdoms are interacting in the early Middle Ages to sort of really understand how warfare is being fought at the time. And I look forward to hearing everybody's thoughts in the comments.